We now continue with Smurf.
I was stationed at Fort Campbell for nearly 2 years, and those months were some of the most memorable of my life. My main job was in communications, fixing radios and antennas, but for a while I got transferred to the military police division as a security guard. I actually enjoyed the change, especially the patrols at night along the quiet back roads and secluded areas of the base. Most nights were uneventful, but there were a few times when things got weird. One encounter stands out more than any other, and it still makes me think about how much goes on behind the scenes in the military. One night in February 1988, I was on patrol with my buddy, Corporal Jay. Jay was a good soldier, professional and easygoing, but sometimes he took things a little bit too seriously. That night, his seriousness almost got us both killed. We were driving around the southern part of the base when we got a radio call from dispatch. The Clarksville Police Department had received a 911 call about a possible crash of a small civilian plane flying low over the base's fence line. Since the caller thought the plane had crashed on base property, the civilian police could not investigate, so they called us. Jay and I were already nearby, so we were assigned to search the area. We were skeptical, since planes do not crash every day, but we followed orders and started looking. The area was less forested, with open patches of land along the roads. We drove slowly, shining our truck's spotlights along the tree lines, not really expecting to find anything. Suddenly, in one of the open fields, we saw what looked like a crash site. We got out of the truck with our flashlights and walked carefully toward the wreckage, trying not to step on any debris. In hindsight, I should have radioed dispatch before leaving the truck, but curiosity got the better of us. We wanted to confirm what we were seeing and check for survivors before reporting in. The wreckage was steaming in the cold night air, and the main fuselage lay among scattered debris about 75 yards away from the road. As we got closer, we realized this was not a civilian plane at all. It was an Apache attack helicopter, or what was left of one. There was no smell of fuel or sign of fire, so we kept approaching, hoping to find survivors. The ground showed a big crater where the helicopter had hit, with pieces buried in the dirt and debris scattered everywhere. Detached rockets were lying around, and there were more craters from where the helicopter had bounced and rolled before stopping. The tops of some trees were damaged, probably from the helicopter clipping them before crashing. The cockpit was destroyed, and it was clear that the pilots had not survived. I told Jay to check the cockpit while I jogged back to the truck radio in the crash. That is when things started to get really strange. I called command on the radio, but after they acknowledged my call, my transmission was drowned out by a weird electronic hum. I tried switching channels, but the interference was everywhere. Since my main job was communications, I knew this was not normal static. There were no power lines nearby, and nothing that should have caused that kind of interference. It felt like someone was intentionally jamming our radio frequencies. Frustrated, I tossed the radio handset onto the seat and grabbed a fire extinguisher before heading back to the wreckage. Jay was standing next to the airframe, staring at the pilot still strapped to the seat. I was about to tell him about the radio problem when I noticed something odd about the pilot's uniform. American pilots usually wear an olive green flight suit, but this guy was wearing old Vietnam-era fatigues with big buttons. I shined my flashlight around, looking for any identifying marks, and saw a foreign flag patch on his sleeve. I recognized it as a Honduran army uniform, which made no sense on an American helicopter. He was wearing the right helmet, with night vision gear and a target display, but he was definitely dead. The nose of the helicopter was obliterated, and the front seat where the gunner would have been was just gone. If there had been 2 men in the helicopter, you would not know it by looking at the wreckage. Jay looked as confused as I was, and I finally told him about the radio interference. We kept searching the area, trying to figure out what to do since we could not communicate with command. One of us stayed close to the wreckage with a fire extinguisher in case it caught fire, hoping to preserve evidence for investigators. Suddenly, we heard vehicles approaching and saw headlights on the road. 2 Humvees and an M35 troop transport truck sped up to the clearing and stopped abruptly. About a dozen soldiers in black uniforms jumped out of the truck, scanning the area with their rifles ready. Their behavior was strange, especially since they kept pointing loaded rifles at us, even though we were fellow soldiers. None of them wore divisional insignia or name tags, just a subdued American flag patch on their sleeves. A few had rank bars, but most had no identifiers at all. A colonel, a lieutenant colonel, and 2 majors got out of the Humvees, but they also had no divisional insignia or name tags. The colonel approached us with 4 soldiers and suddenly shouted, "You will leave now." Jay, being by the book, told the colonel we could not leave until we were properly relieved according to regulations. The colonel was clearly not happy with that response. He turned to one of the black uniformed soldiers and said, "Sergeant, if they are not gone in 30 seconds, kill them." He added, "and dispose of their bodies," while pointing at the wrecked Apache. The sergeant raised his rifle and pointed it directly at Jay's chest. I'm not a good poker player, but I know when to fold. I turned and walked back to the truck without saying a word, got in the driver's seat, started the engine, and put it in gear. I stared straight ahead at the road, hoping Jay would get in the truck. Thankfully, he climbed into the passenger seat a few seconds later, and I drove us out of there as fast as I could. After a while, the radio suddenly came back to life, and dispatch called to ask if we were okay. I replied as calmly as I could that we were fine. They asked what I had tried to say in my initial transmission before the interference started. I hesitated, then said that we had not found anything yet and planned to continue searching the area. Several hours later, when our shift ended, our commander pulled us into his office. He asked us if we had found anything during our search, and I knew better than to say anything. I quietly said that we had not seen anything unusual, and Jay nodded in agreement. The commander seemed relieved by our answers and dismissed us. I left the station and drove straight home, not even stopping for food. I sat in the dark in my tiny apartment, replaying the night's events in my mind. I wondered why things like this happened to me, but I could not come up with an answer. Eventually I went to bed, still thinking about what had happened. We never heard anything about a civilian plane crash, and I never asked anyone about it. 4 years afterward, I wondered if the colonel was bluffing, or if he really would have killed us if we had not left. I started to wonder what happened to the bodies of the men who died in that crash. Did their remains just disappear into another classified government secret? As for why a Honduran soldier was piloting an American helicopter, I eventually learned that the Apache was being used to train foreign pilots. In March 1988, thousands of U.S. military personnel deployed to Honduras for Operation Golden Pheasant. I had been deployed to Honduras myself in December 1986, helping build an airfield for future operations. The U.S. was still following its policy of preventing the spread of communism in Central America, backing anti-communist groups like the Contras in Nicaragua. Operation Golden Pheasant was officially a joint training exercise, but our soldiers were ready to fight if needed. Rumor had it the Sandinistas were operating illegally in Honduras, and American troops were sent to push them out. Pentagon officials assured the public that our troops would stay away from the border, but the real story was probably more complicated. After the rapid deployment, the Sandinistas withdrew, and U.S. troops left by the end of the month. The U.S. government's support for the Contras was controversial, especially after it was discovered that arms were being sold through Iran to bypass Congress. That controversy was just one example of what happens when government and military secrets come to light. I still don't know if this explains the crashed helicopter with the Honduran pilot, or the strange behavior of the colonel and his soldiers. I am not going to green text this one. I am not going to go into what my profession is or any details about it, but a portion of it has to do with my story. I have not been snuck up on in 5 years. 5 years ago, I was conducting a training exercise, during which I was supposed to be pulling security, standing watch, over my patrol during recovery operations in the woodline in what we call a patrol base, which is essentially an area that a military unit rests and recovers in while in a hostile area. I ended up falling asleep. I was very green to patrolling, and I was so very tired. It was around 3 a.m., the second night of a sleepless and foodless training event designed to break our unit down and be a test of mental agility and resilience, then test us with complex tasks. Anyways, One of the instructors who was playing op for opposing force came up on my position and woke me up, informed me I had failed my buddies in the patrol, and punished me very severely. The level of punishment was close to traumatizing, and ever since, I have never been snuck up on again. I have since become both completely restless when pulling security and a very light sleeper. I also have since developed a very acute sense of when someone is trying to move towards me, even if it is in a non-hostile way, like to say hello or something. I can't quite describe what it is like, it's just that I can feel it in the air. I do not believe it is a paranormal feeling. I think it must have something to do with my senses. Regardless, I have since spent many nights in dark wilderness by myself, but usually with a team, in unfamiliar places. I recently finished a stint as a land navigation instructor for a well-known course, and one of my jobs was to go into the course during night land nav, which takes place of course during dark hours, and find lost personnel. I have absolutely no problems whatsoever with dark woods. I have had run-ins with wildlife as well. As personnel who were attempting to find me, point being, the woods have not frightened me in a long time. Recently, I volunteered to be a camp counselor during time I had between transferring stations at a church camp. When the time came for the seniors to have their camp out, it was natural that I was chosen to lead it. The camp out was fine, typical camp out, but when we sat around the fire, I felt it. I felt someone approaching me. I turned around and knew I would see someone. I knew I had to. This feeling was just as clear to me as sight itself. But there was nothing. Not even when I pitched the sky against the foliage did any silhouettes appear. There was nothing. My campers could tell that I was confused, but I shrugged it off. But it happened again and again, and each time I did not see anything or detect anything. I specifically placed myself in a position to draw out confidence from anyone who could have been pursuing me or attempting to play a prank on my group in order to try and tempt them out of their spot and react very swiftly to it. But it never happened. I was sure I would at least hear movement towards or away from my position as I had been trained, but it just never happened. Regardless, I kept getting that feeling. That night the males got into their tent and the females got into theirs, and we went to sleep. I woke up very shortly after to what I said at the time was the noise of somebody maneuvering around our tent. Who knows though, it could have just been that feeling. I thought the girls were trying to play a joke on us. I organized the boys to slowly and carefully prep to bust out of the tent and catch the girls in the act, but when we did, they were in their tent asleep. The boys trusted me a lot and they were rightly freaked out, but I told them I was just mistaken, although in my own heart, I was dead set that someone or something, an animal, although I was positive it was a human being, was in our area, attempting to execute some sort of action on our tent. We went back to the tent, and as the boys fell asleep, my senses surged. I tried to ignore it, but my better sense would not allow it. My heart was pounding, my body was pitched into a very active state. I got up as quietly as I could, and made movement to the front of our tent. I woke up one of the boys, the one I trusted the most, called him number 1, and left him with a contingency plan. Pretty much said, if I do not return within 20 minutes, or you hear me attacked, get the entire group together and light the fire, stay by the fire, and call the rest of the camp. Of course, he freaked, and as I left the tent, he woke up the other boys, and they watched me as I went on to find whatever it was. I basically pulled a simple dogleg. First, I grabbed the wood-cutting axe which I had placed right outside of my tent, and I made movement towards the thickest patch of vegetation I could find. Then turned 90 degrees and traveled as fast as I could without making an audibly discriminating amount of noise 2 terrain features away. Then circumvented the campsite and arrived right back around 10 meters away from the front of the tent, nestled between a tree trunk and a thicket. I knew I had performed the maneuver properly, as the boys who were all peeking out of the tent were arguing with each other that I had left and was either coming back soon or was never coming back. My plan was this: wait in my position for whatever person was trying to disturb our tent, let them attempt contact on the tent, and then counter their action with my own. A wood chopping axe is not much for an offensive weapon, especially in the dark, but the heavy end would at least be good for a knockdown, so I could roll some proper groundwork on whoever it was. That was my plan anyways. I sat in this position for more than 20 minutes, which was my cutoff time for my plan that I left my number one, but he did not follow through, which was fine, as I was within the bounds of my counteroffensive plan anyways, so I stayed in position. I sat for a number of hours. The boys eventually fell asleep. I sat, watching, waiting, ready to pounce, but as my adrenaline ebbed and my thoughts began to bounce around in my head, as they always do when on patrol, I started to doubt my sense and began to tire. Not that I was falling asleep, I was just losing interest and faith in my action. What happened next, I suppose, is the climax to the story. The feeling returned very hard, although it was more of a feeling towards the tent. I knew something was heading for it, and it was a deeper feeling than that. I knew that something was heading for the boys. I knew that something was about to attempt an offensive action on the boys. I have in the past very successfully defended positions based on this feeling alone, and I have never been wrong in 5 years. I knew it was about to happen. My adrenaline kicked into high gear. I could feel my neck start to get sore on the side under my jaw, which is what always happens to me when I get very, very primed, and I was absolutely ready to go. I just switched modes. I went from recon to assault. I went from maritime to combat. I let the axe down on the ground. It's a strange thing, but I knew that it would only hinder me. I have been trained with firearms, knives, e-tools, and my body, but not an axe. It would just hinder my chances at success. I could sense it on the other side of the tent. I knew it was there. I knew it was enacting its action right now. I went hard, straight line towards the corner of the tent and button hooked in. I did not want any space to assess the situation before I attacked. I wanted a fully aggressive offensive action against whatever it was. I wanted surprise, and I wanted to get my hands on the person or whatever. I got my hands on it. I didn't really utilize any takedown method. I just plowed it into the ground and was moving to get into a top mount, but touching it, it just wasn't a man, and it was not an animal that I knew of. First off, an animal is very fast and very reactive. The odds of snatching an animal like that were slim to nil, but I had gotten it. But when I touched it, I can't really recall to describe, but it wasn't anything I knew. I had already attacked it, and my training told me to press the advantage, but I simply could not. Of course, this description of combatives is going to sound sexual, but whatever. Grow up. I let go and scooted back, opening my legs and lifting up my hips. I was scared to continue to attack it, and moved back frantically and wound up on my back, and my body just automatically assumed to the downward position to accept an enemy combatant in hand-to-hand combat with as many defensive options as possible. Whatever it was ran to the woodline and turned around. I had scared it. I had dominated it, I guess, but then I had backed off, and it could sense that I was no longer in control of the pitch of the combat. It could tell that I had resolved the defense and not offense, so it sat. I couldn't really see it. I did not dare to move from my position to try and pitch it against the sky and reveal some familiar silhouette, or perhaps I was too scared to see that it might be some hideous, nightmarish outline. But there we sat, staring at each other. After a few seconds, I sprang back up into my fighting stance, but it stayed and did not react. It was no longer intimidated. It was not even reacting. It was very calm. Not a good sign. I could not go to it. I could not engage it. I did not know what to do. I had so much training under my belt to fight human beings, but from what I just felt, this was not a human being. All I could do was slowly back off, get back into the tent, seal the zipper, and protect my boys. That is all I could do. All I could do was wait, confused and scared. As soon as first light came over the horizon, my sense ebbed. I knew it was gone. That morning we packed up and went back to main camp. I immediately told the priest. I did not want to tell the boys, although they asked me what had happened the previous hours, but he said it was a prank some local was playing on me. I've not been that scared since. It hasn't affected anything that I do in my profession. I still go out and find lost individuals trying to complete land nav at night to their dismay, and I still train within the woodline, but I just can't recall that night without deep puzzlement and a bit of fear. I don't know what it was. I don't know why it never came back. I don't know how I could not detect it directly. I only had contact with it for a second. I was in guard for about 5 seconds, and then we had sat staring at each other. That only lasted around 10 seconds. The whole length of the contact was around 20 seconds maximum. It just freaks me out sometimes when I am alone in my home. Only when I am in my home. Not even when I am alone in the dark woods. Just when I am at home. It stood on 2 legs. That's how I knocked it over. It was facing in towards the tent on 2 legs. Like I said, I came around the side of the tent, so I hit its side, at an angle, which is exactly what you want when taking down somebody. If it was on 4 legs, facing towards the tent, it would have toppled and booked it back to get up. When I took it down, it swung down, being that its only support was taken out from underneath it, and it fell onto its abdomen. It did not grasp limbs at this point, like I said, I just plowed into it, my shoulders to its hip. It at least stood on 2 legs and had a torso. I cannot describe what it felt like, I just can't recall. Not even after I touched it. It just felt wrong. It did not feel human. That made me twitch back and fall automatically. I recoiled away from it in fear. Hey, hope you've enjoyed the story so far. If you want to hear more, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and leave a comment because it lets YouTube know you like the content and helps more people to see these videos. My next big goal for the channel is 100,000 subscribers, and as a celebration, I will be doing a Q&A video once we hit that goal. Thank you, and back to the stories. I had been deployed to Iraq from 2004 to 2005, and more specifically, that I took part in what became known as the Second Battle of Fallujah. I only felt true horror once in my entire military career. I'm talking horror that isn't just related to the horrors of war. It happened in a half-finished 2-story house in a Fallujah neighborhood called Jolin. Without boring you with too much strategic or historical detail, Fallujah was probably the toughest fight the Marine Corps had been in since Sioux City in Vietnam. We faced a very different enemy in Fallujah than anywhere else in southern Iraq. In other places, you had militias like the Mahdi army, and in Baghdad, it was mostly former Iraqi army guys who had gone underground and were running an insurgency from the shadows. But in Fallujah, it was like the international jihadi all-stars had shown up, and the chance to fight the US attracted a lot of skilled fighters. There were Al-Qaeda-aligned terrorists from all over the world coming to Fallujah, and a lot of them were only still alive because they were very good at what they did. The Second Battle of Fallujah happened after the first battle had been a wake-up call for our commanding officers. The enemy was dug in like Alabama ticks, and they were being taught urban warfare and booby-trap manufacturing by guys who had been fighting in various wars for almost 20 years by that point. As soon as our COs realized what we were up against, they pulled us out of Fallujah, called for reinforcements, and started working on a much more intricate plan to take the city without completely destroying it. A few months later, I was back in Fallujah, fighting house to house with tanks and Cobra support. The fighting in Fallujah was kind of like chess, with each building in a city block being like a square on a chessboard, and winning each engagement was all about where you had your pieces. Only, imagine you are playing chess, and you cannot see where some of your opponent's pieces are until you put one of your pieces in the same square. This meant that every so often, we had to send an assault team out into dead ground to secure a building on the enemy's flank. That was not an enviable task, because sometimes you got lucky, and sometimes you did not, and the enemy had a real knack for surprising us. One time, me and 3 other guys were sent out to a building surrounded by a high wall. Recon had spotted a single hole in the outer wall, which made the place great for defense, but it also meant the building was being used by the enemy, who had probably blown a hole in the wall themselves. Recon had not seen any movement around the building, but that did not mean that there was nobody there, so we had to be extremely cautious. We snuck up to the wall, climbed through the waist-high hole in the concrete, and started making our way toward the first door that we saw. We stacked up outside, but as we did, we could hear a guy inside shouting out some Arabic name, because he had heard us and thought we were his buddies. He was shouting, and when his buddy did not answer, he started to panic. We knew we had to force entry right then, or this guy might alert his friends. One of us pushed open the door, and our saw gunner guy saw the guy right there in the hallway, AK in hand, with a look of pure shock on his face. The guy tried to bring his AK up, but it was too late, and our saw gunner put a burst of about 15 bullets into his chest and stomach. The guy dropped like a sack of potatoes, and we left his body lying there in the hallway, dead as a doornail. 3 guys headed downstairs to watch over the surrounding area, while I was left watching a window that overlooked the hole in the wall. My job was simple: watch the hole and shoot anyone who tried to climb through it who was not American. A few minutes went by, and then one of my buddies upstairs shouted down at me to go grab the dead guy's phone, since stuff like that was valuable for intel. Since he had the point of entry covered from an upstairs window, I was safe to move without worrying about the enemy sneaking into the compound. I stepped out of the room and walked into the corridor, but instead of a dead body with 20 bullet holes in him, there was just a pool of blood and no body. The dead body had disappeared. Right away, I called out to my buddies that we had a situation, because dead bodies do not just get up and walk away. We had already cleared the ground floor, so we knew that no one else could be inside with us. But what really freaked me out was that there were no drag marks, just a pool of blood and a few drops leading off into another room at the back of the building. When it hit me that our dead body had just stood up after being shot 15 to 20 times, I felt a chill run through me. It did not make sense, not by any natural law, because I had looked at him with my own 2 eyes and I knew he was dead. So how the hell did he just stand up and walk off? One of my buddies came downstairs, and we started slowly making our way to the doorway that the drops of blood were leading to. We decided to toss a grenade in first, but the second the grenade went into that room, we heard boots against the concrete before the wounded enemy fighter came hurtling out of the room with a knife raised above his head, ready to stab us. Usually, these guys would shout something before they shot at you or charged, but this guy was completely silent, and his eyes were so wide they looked freakishly large. As he came around the corner with his knife held high, all I could do was back up to keep from being stabbed. Even though my buddy behind me put 2 or 3 more shots into him, he kept coming at me with that knife. It was literally like a zombie movie. I was yelling, "Shoot him in the head, shoot him in the head," over and over, but my buddy had to get up real close with his barrel at an angle where he would not hit me too. It was really touch and go for a while, but eventually, my buddy was able to get right up close without getting stabbed and pulled the trigger 3 times. Boom, 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 until the attacker's head just disintegrated and he finally stopped moving. I know a lot of people will think that I am making this up, because nobody in the history of medicine has survived 20 shots and kept on fighting. But I swear, this guy did. It was not because he was a zombie, it was because he was on drugs. Later that day, after we searched the building, we found all kinds of needles and bottles of adrenaline and amphetamines. These insurgents had been shooting up before going into battle, so they would be less afraid and more aggressive. It did not really work for them, I guess, because it just made them reckless. But when it came to being able to sustain injuries and keep on fighting, I never saw anything like it anywhere else. It really was like being in a zombie movie, and it was not just that one guy. I know dozens of Fallujah vets who have stories like this, where they had to shoot a guy in the head just to get him to stop moving. I have one spooky story, but I'm going to share the short version only. I was around 8 years old when this happened. I get really lost in the woods. It starts to get really dark. I start to cry because I'm only 8 and I'm lost, and I just want to go home. I suddenly hear this singing. I start following the singing. There is a circle of odd-looking mushrooms where the singing is coming from. I touch the center of it. The ground falls apart. I fall in. I have weird fuzzy memories. I distinctly remember a young voice. "Remember, you owe your life." I wake back up again near the campsite. To this day, I have no explanation for this. I have never told anyone that I know.